There is one thing the mind does constantly, even when you don't ask it to, even when you are exhausted, even when all you want is silence. It looks for what could go wrong. And this is not a flaw. This is a survival mechanism. Siddhartha Gautama was born into a royal family. His life was designed so that he would never encounter anxiety, no loss, no instability, no chaos. From the outside, it looked like a perfect system. But the mind does not need external chaos to create internal tension. Silence around you does not guarantee silence within you. Anxiety is not a reaction to the world. It is a reaction to thinking about the world. Even inside a palace, the inner movement does not disappear, because the mind is always working. It generates questions even without reason. What happens next? What am I not seeing? What might change? And these questions have no end, because the mind was not built for stillness. It was built for prediction. The more you try to switch off your thoughts, the stronger they become. Resistance to thoughts only intensifies anxiety. Siddhartha does not yet understand what is happening inside him, but something is already moving, quietly, without form, without name. And this will feel familiar to anyone who has ever lain awake at night and could not sleep, when everything outside is fine, and yet inside there is movement. Right now, you don't need to stop it. You don't need to analyze it. Simply notice it. Then comes the first journey beyond the palace walls, not as a trip, but as contact with reality. Siddhartha sees aging, a body that changes, slowly, inevitably, without control. Then he sees illness, a condition that does not yield to willpower and does not ask permission. And then he sees death, the end of form, the end of roles, the end of stability. Reality does not change. Only what you are willing to see changes. Anxiety often arises not from events themselves, but from the awareness that they are possible. And in that moment, the mind begins to build meaning, not simply to see, but to interpret. And it is the interpretation that creates tension. Because if there is death, then there is uncertainty. If there is uncertainty, then there is no complete control. And this is the key fracture. Siddhartha does not run back. He returns. But now everything looks different. Not because the world has changed, but because perception has changed. Once the mind has seen uncertainty, it can no longer ignore it. And now an inner process begins. Not dramatic, but slow. Questions without answers. Movement without form. And this is familiar to anyone who has ever suddenly understood something that they can no longer unknow. And then anxiety arrives, not as fear, but as a response to an expanded awareness. Anxiety is the attempt to live in the future while standing in the present. The mind carries an uncertain future into the present moment, and that is what creates the tension. Siddhartha returns to the palace, but the palace is no longer the same. Not because it has changed outwardly, but because perception has changed. And this is the moment where the real story begins. Not escape, not a decision, but observation. Right now, you don't need to resolve anything. The night asks nothing of you. It makes no demands. It simply continues. Thoughts may arise, but they are not required to lead you anywhere. They are like noise. They are like the movement of air. You can see them and not enter them. And that is enough. Because even now, the body is already beginning to slow down. Not through effort, but naturally. And this is the first real step of this story. Not control, but awareness. Not struggle, but distance. Not an answer, but observation. After a person sees what was previously hidden, a natural reaction appears. Control. Because if the world is unpredictable, then it must be outplayed. Checked. The risks reduced. The uncertainty cut off. And Siddhartha does what almost every mind does under tension. He goes to the extreme. He leaves comfort. He gives up stability. He tries to achieve complete control through the opposite, through the rejection of everything. When inner anxiety grows, a person often chooses not peace, but extremity. The mind mistakenly believes that strong action means quick relief, but the nervous system does not work that way. He restricts himself. Less food, less sleep, less of everything that gives the body comfort. The logic seems simple. If I reduce my needs, I will reduce my anxiety. But the opposite happens. The body grows weaker. The mind grows louder. Thoughts become more intrusive. Because anxiety does not disappear through exhaustion. It simply becomes more audible. When the body is depleted, the mind loses its filters. Less resource means more chaotic thoughts. And this is an important moment, because the modern person does the same thing. Works more, sleeps less, thinks more, and expects peace. But the nervous system does not reward overload with calm. It responds to overload with more anxiety. Siddhartha spends years in this state, but nothing stabilizes. And then a new awareness appears. Not intellectual, but physical. That extremity does not work. Pain does not disappear through intensity. It only changes form. Physical discomfort can be replaced with mental discomfort, but the tension itself cannot simply be removed. And this is the key fracture. Because most people in anxiety move between two extremes, control or chaos. But neither of them brings stability. Control creates tension. Chaos creates fear. And the mind begins to spin between these two states, like a pendulum. Siddhartha notices something else. The more he tries to resolve his inner state, the more acute it becomes. And this sounds familiar. When you lie there and think, I need to calm down, and it only gets worse. Because the very attempt at control is itself tension. Trying to stop thoughts is also a thought. There is no external exit from an internal process through force. And then exhaustion begins. Not physical, but mental. Exhaustion from the constant attempt to fix something inside. And this is a very quiet state. It cannot be seen from the outside, but it changes everything on the inside. An important moment for you now. You might notice how the mind sometimes does the same thing. It plans. It analyzes. It runs through scenarios, returns to them again, and calls this solving problems. But often it is simply the repetition of the same process. Thinking becomes anxiety when it has no way out. Closed thinking creates an internal loop without action and without completion. Siddhartha gradually reaches the edge of this state. not through ideas, but through experience. That extreme control does not bring peace, and extreme rejection does not either. Both paths create tension, and this is important, because here there is no enlightenment yet. There is only the understanding that the old ways do not work. And right now, the night asks nothing of you. You are not required to solve your life tonight. You don't need to finish your thoughts. You don't need to stop them. They can simply pass through, like waves, like the movement of air, like background noise. And you can remain here, in this moment, without action, without analysis. Because even now, the body is already beginning to return to balance. Not through control, but through the release of tension. And this is the first real shift, not in events, but in how we relate to them. After extremes, one thing always follows. Not enlightenment, not an answer, but exhaustion. Exhaustion from trying to fix something inside yourself. Exhaustion from control. Exhaustion from fighting your own mind. Siddhartha arrives at exactly this state, not as a philosopher, but as a person who has tested both poles. He tried comfort, and it did not bring peace. He tried extremity, and it did not bring peace either. And here an important moment appears. When both extremes equally fail to work, the mind for the first time stops believing that the answer lies within them. When two opposite paths do not work, a third begins to appear, not as an idea, but as a state. The middle path is not invented. It emerges when the extremes exhaust the system. And this third state is not sudden. It does not look like a solution. It looks like the swinging stopping, like a pendulum that gradually ceases to strike from one side to the other. Now it is important to understand. The middle path is not a compromise. It is not a little less stress, and not a little more control. It is an entirely different principle. Balance is not the golden mean. It is the absence of struggle between extremes. Anxiety lives in the oscillation. Peace appears when the oscillation decreases. Siddhartha begins to notice something simple. When the body is not overloaded and not depleted, thoughts behave differently. They do not disappear, but they stop dominating. And this is a critical moment, because most people think, in order to be calm, you must remove your thoughts. But this is not possible. Thinking cannot be switched off. It only changes in intensity. Peace does not come after thoughts stop. It comes after the relationship with them changes. You do not control the appearance of thoughts, but you do control your participation in them. And here a different quality of experience begins. Not struggle, not rejection, but observation. At this point, there is no dramatic turning point. No moment of I finally understand everything. There is only a gradual lowering of tension, like a body that stops being in a constant state of readiness. As if for the first time it is not anticipating an immediate threat. And this is a very quiet process. It is almost impossible to notice right away, because the mind is accustomed to movement, to analysis, to tension. But here the movement slows down, not through effort, but through the absence of excessive pressure. And this is important, because right now you might notice the same thing in yourself. Not as a change of state, but as a reduction in the need to change anything at all. When you stop forcing yourself to calm down, calm begins to appear on its own. The nervous system recovers not through control, but through safety. Siddhartha does not yet call this a path. He has not yet formulated the idea. He has not yet created a system. He simply sees. Extremes exhaust. And this knowledge is not intellectual. It is experience. And here begins to form what will later be called the middle way. Not as a rule, but as a natural state that requires no extremes. Now bring your attention back to yourself. You have nothing to fix in this moment. You do not need to change your breathing. You do not need to control your thoughts. You can simply remain here, in this pace, in this rhythm. Because even now the nervous system does not need a solution. It needs the absence of pressure. And that is exactly what is beginning to happen. A slow lowering of inner resistance. Not as an event, but as a process. And this is the beginning of the middle way. Not as a concept, but as the experience of the absence of extremes. There is a moment in every mind when something quietly changes. Not dramatically, not with insight, but with exhaustion from resistance. Siddhartha Gautama is no longer living in extremes. Not comfort, not deprivation. Something else is starting to appear. Still undefined, still fragile. He is sitting in silence more often now. Not because silence is holy, but because noise is becoming harder to sustain. And this is important. The mind does not stop thinking. It stops believing every thought deserves attention. Thoughts don't disappear. Their authority disappears. Anxiety is not caused by thinking itself, but by automatic identification with thoughts. At night, the mind becomes louder for most people, because there is no external distraction left. Only internal processing remains. Plans, regrets, possible futures, imagined risks. This is where anxiety usually grows, not in events, but in interpretation loops. Siddhartha begins to notice something subtle. Thoughts arise, but they also leave. Without effort, without control, just like sounds in the distance. Everything that appears in the mind also dissolves in the mind. Mental content is temporary. Anxiety increases when we treat it as permanent or urgent. He is not trying to stop thinking. He is not trying to force calm. He is observing. And this changes everything. Because resistance creates tension, and observation creates distance. Now imagine this in modern terms. You are lying down at night. The brain starts producing scenarios. What if I fail? What if something goes wrong? What if I'm not ready? And instead of fighting these thoughts, you simply notice. This is a mental event, not a prediction, not a command. A thought is not a direction. It is a movement. The brain generates simulations. They are not instructions for action unless you engage with them. Siddhartha begins to reduce engagement, not suppression, not avoidance, just less reaction. And something interesting happens. The mind becomes less intense, not because it is controlled, but because it is no longer amplified. There is a key misunderstanding most people have. If I stop controlling my thoughts, everything will collapse. But what actually collapses is the illusion of control, not stability. Calm is not created. It is uncovered when interference stops. The nervous system naturally returns to balance when overactivation decreases. At night, the body begins its own work. Breathing slows. Muscles release tension. Attention narrows naturally. You don't need to force this. It is already happening. Siddhartha is learning something very simple. Not how to control the mind, but how not to interfere with it. And this is the beginning of a different relationship with thought. Not war, not obedience, just coexistence. Now, gently notice something. You are not required to solve anything right now. Not tonight. Not in this moment. The mind may continue producing content, but you are not obligated to engage with it. Peace begins when participation ends. You cannot force mental silence, but you can stop feeding mental loops. There is no urgency here, no deadline in this moment, no decision that must be made now. Only experience, only breathing, only passing thoughts. Siddhartha has not reached awakening. He has only stopped fighting experience itself. And that alone changes everything internally. Because suffering increases when experience is resisted, and decreases when experience is allowed. So now, in this quiet space, let thoughts come, let thoughts go, without adding weight to them. No correction needed, no control required, no solution necessary. And slowly, the nervous system begins to understand something deeper. I am not under threat right now, not intellectually, but physically. And that is where calm begins, not as an idea, but as a shift in regulation. The mind settles when it no longer believes every signal is an emergency. Anxiety is a false urgency signal. It weakens when the body stops interpreting thoughts as threats. Siddhartha remains present, not trying to escape, not trying to fix, just observing the movement of mind. And in this observation, something new begins to form. A quieter kind of awareness. One that does not react immediately. One that does not rush to conclusions. This is the night practice. Not meditation as ritual, but awareness without interference. And you can stay here too. Without effort, without pressure, without needing to change anything. Just this moment, just this breath, just this passing night. There is a point in every inner journey where something shifts again. Not loudly, not visibly, but structurally. Siddhartha Gautama is no longer reacting to every thought with urgency, but he is also not free in the way people imagine freedom. Something more subtle is happening. He is beginning to notice the space between experience and reaction. And that space is where everything changes. Because most suffering does not come from what happens. It comes from the immediate reaction to what happens. Suffering is not the event. It is the resistance to the event. Pain is physical or emotional input. Suffering is the mental fight against it. At night, the mind behaves like a prediction machine. It does not stay in the present. It moves into simulation. What could go wrong? What might fail? What is not yet stable? And the more uncertain life feels, the more active this simulation becomes. Siddhartha begins to observe something very precise. Thoughts are not stable entities. They are movements, temporary formations, not truths, not instructions, just appearances. And this changes the internal reaction. Because when something is not truth, it loses authority. A thought is not reality. It is a mental event passing through awareness. Anxiety increases when thoughts are treated as facts instead of mental activity. Most people try to eliminate uncomfortable thoughts, but elimination creates tension because the mind interprets resistance as threat. So there is a loop. Thought appears, resistance appears, more thought appears, and this loop is what we call anxiety. Siddhartha is not breaking thoughts. He is no longer feeding the loop. And slowly, the loop weakens, not because it is attacked, but because it is not reinforced. There is a deeper realization forming here, not intellectual, experiential, that the mind does not need correction. It needs space. What you resist does not disappear. It persists in a different form. Mental resistance maintains psychological activation. At this stage, nothing dramatic happens externally. There is no sudden transformation, no visible change, only reduced inner tension, like a system that stops overloading itself. And this is where modern anxiety becomes very visible. Because most people are not suffering from life itself. They are suffering from constant interpretation of life. Every silence becomes a question. Every delay becomes uncertainty. Every unknown becomes a threat. And the mind fills gaps automatically, not because it is broken, but because it is trained to predict. Siddhartha begins to notice the cost of prediction. It does not create safety. It creates continuous mental activity. And that activity feels like urgency, even when nothing is happening. The mind confuses activity with protection. Overthinking is often mistaken for problem solving, but it is usually threat simulation. Now something subtle begins to shift. Instead of trying to solve internal noise, he begins to observe it as noise. No hierarchy, no importance, just occurrence. And when importance is removed, intensity drops. This is not suppression. This is reclassification. Thoughts are no longer treated as signals that require action. They are treated as passing phenomena. And in this shift, something very quiet appears. A sense of distance. Not emotional distance. Perceptual distance. The mind is still active, but it is no longer fused with identity. You are not inside every thought anymore. You are observing them moving. And that alone reduces pressure. Because pressure requires involvement. Without involvement, pressure collapses. At night, this becomes especially clear. When there is nothing external to anchor attention, the internal world becomes louder. But if attention is not attached, noise remains noise. Not threat, not direction, not reality, just movement. Siddhartha is not escaping experience. He is no longer tightening around it. And this is the beginning of something deeper than control. Not escape, not suppression, not force, but non-interference. And non-interference is not passive. It is precise. It is aware. It is stable without effort. Stability does not come from control. It comes from reduced interference. The nervous system calms when it is not constantly being activated by interpretation. Now gently notice. There is nothing you need to resolve right now. Not in this moment. Not in this state. Life continues without your constant mental supervision. Breathing continues. Body regulates itself. Mind produces content. And you can simply allow that. Without adding weight, without adding urgency, without adding meaning where it is not required. Siddhartha is still observing, still present, still aware, but no longer entangled. And this is where the next shift begins, not in thinking, but in understanding through direct experience. That peace is not something created. It is something uncovered when resistance stops. And this quiet recognition is enough for now. At some point, something changes in a way that is almost too simple to notice. Not a breakthrough, not an insight, just a reduction in internal effort. Siddhartha Gautama is no longer swinging between extremes. Not pleasure, not deprivation, not control, not collapse. Something quieter begins to form. A stable middle state, not as a philosophy, but as a lived experience. And this is important, because most people misunderstand balance. They think balance means half of everything. But real balance is not arithmetic. It is nervous system regulation. Balance is not choosing the middle. It is stopping the swing between extremes. Anxiety often comes from oscillation. Over-control versus overload. Stability reduces that oscillation. Now the mind behaves differently. It still produces thoughts, but it stops escalating them. A thought appears, and instead of expansion, there is recognition. Just a thought, not a signal, not a problem, not a command. And this subtle shift changes everything internally, because intensity depends on engagement. Siddhartha begins to notice something very precise. When there is no resistance, thoughts lose pressure. When there is no reaction, thoughts lose urgency. Not because they disappear, but because they are not amplified anymore. The mind does not need fewer thoughts. It needs less identification with them. Distress is not caused by thinking, but by merging identity with thoughts. At night, this becomes even more noticeable. The mind still generates scenarios, future outcomes, possible failures, unfinished concerns. But something different happens now. They do not escalate into emotional certainty. They remain what they are, mental constructions. And mental constructions are temporary, not stable, not predictive, not absolute. Siddhartha is not rejecting thoughts. He is not trying to stop them. He is simply no longer treating them as reality. And this creates space. Space between stimulus and reaction. Space between thought and identity. Space between sensation and interpretation. And in that space, anxiety weakens. Not because it is fought, but because it is no longer reinforced. Anxiety survives through interpretation, not through experience itself. Raw experience is neutral until the mind assigns threat value to it. Now the nervous system begins to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually reducing alertness. The body does not stay in constant readiness. It begins to trust stillness again. And this is not a mental decision. It is a physiological adjustment. Breathing slows without instruction. Muscles soften without effort. Attention stops scanning for danger. This is the body remembering safety. Siddhartha is still observing everything, but the tone of observation has changed. Less urgency, less friction, less internal pressure. And this is where the middle path stops being a concept and becomes a state of regulation. Not extreme stimulation, not extreme deprivation, not constant correction, just continuity. Stability is what remains when the system stops overcorrecting itself. Chronic anxiety is often driven by constant internal correction attempts. Now something very subtle appears. Not happiness, not euphoria, not insight, but reduced compulsion to react. And this is extremely important, because most suffering is reactive, not experiential. When reaction slows, suffering loses structure. Siddhartha begins to see that the mind does not need to be controlled. It needs to be understood as a process. And once it is seen as a process, it becomes less threatening. Because processes are not enemies. They are patterns. Now bring attention gently back to yourself. Not to analyze, not to fix, just to notice. You are not required to respond to every internal signal. Not tonight, not in this moment. Thoughts may still appear, but they do not define what is happening. They are just movement in awareness. And you can allow that movement without joining it, without resisting it, without amplifying it. Siddhartha is not achieving something here. He is no longer adding unnecessary effort to experience. And that reduction of effort is what creates stability. Not force, not discipline, not suppression, but non-escalation. And in that non-escalation, the system begins to settle. Not into silence, but into simplicity. And simplicity is enough. At this stage, something very quiet is happening. Not transformation in the dramatic sense, not enlightenment as a concept, but a gradual disappearance of urgency. Siddhartha Gautama is still sitting, still observing. But the relationship to experience has changed again. Not through effort, but through exhaustion of effort. There is no longer a need to fix internal states. No need to correct thoughts. No need to stop anything. And this is important, because most anxiety is built on the assumption, this must be solved. But what if it doesn't? What if nothing in this moment requires resolution? Not everything that appears in the mind is a problem to be solved. The brain labels internal activity as problems, but most mental content is just activity, not actionable reality. Now thoughts continue to arise. That does not change. What changes is interpretation. A thought appears. What if something goes wrong? And instead of entering it, there is recognition. This is a mental simulation. Not true, not false, just constructed. And the moment it stops being labeled as threat, intensity drops. Siddhartha is not controlling thought. He is no longer feeding interpretation loops. And this creates a very specific internal state. Stillness without suppression. Clarity without effort. Peace is not the absence of thought. It is the absence of struggle with thought. Mental silence is not required for calm. Reduced resistance is enough to shift the nervous system. At night, this becomes even more visible. Because external input disappears, only internal processes remain. And for most people, this is where anxiety grows. Because silence becomes a screen for projections. But now something different happens. Silence is no longer interpreted as emptiness. It is experienced as neutral space. Not threatening, not demanding, just present. Siddhartha notices that the mind does not need intervention to settle. It needs non-escalation. When attention does not amplify a thought, it fades naturally. Not instantly, but inevitably. What is not reinforced does not persist with intensity. Attention is the fuel of mental persistence. Without reinforcement, thoughts lose momentum. Now there is a deeper layer forming, not conceptual understanding, but experiential stability. The system begins to trust itself again, not because everything is known, but because everything does not need to be known. And this is a critical shift. From control-based safety to uncertainty-tolerant safety. Most anxiety comes from intolerance of uncertainty. The need to complete the picture, to resolve ambiguity, to predict outcomes. But here, something else is emerging. Tolerance without resolution. Siddhartha is not solving uncertainty. He is no longer reacting to it as threat. And that changes the nervous system response entirely. Because the body reacts not to truth, but to perceived urgency. If there is no urgency signal, there is no activation spike. The nervous system calms when urgency is no longer interpreted into every thought. Anxiety is driven by perceived immediacy, not by actual external danger. Now the body begins to soften further. Breathing becomes less monitored. Muscles stop holding microtension. Attention stops scanning continuously. Not through command, through reduction of internal conflict. And Siddhartha remains present, not trying to reach a state, not trying to maintain anything, just witnessing experience without interference. And this is where something very subtle appears. A kind of baseline clarity, not emotional high, not intellectual insight, but reduction of inner friction. Now gently bring this into your own awareness. There is nothing required from you right now. Not mentally, not emotionally, not structurally. You are not obligated to complete any thought cycle. You are not required to respond to any internal signal. Thoughts may still arise, but they do not define the moment. They do not dictate action. They do not require resolution. And you can allow them to pass through awareness, without resistance, without attachment, without escalation. Siddhartha is still in the night, still in stillness, still in awareness, but no longer in struggle. And this is the threshold, not of achievement, but of release from unnecessary effort. And in this release, the mind begins to settle naturally, not into silence, but into balance. And balance, in this state, is enough. At this point, something very important has already changed. But it did not happen as a single moment. It happened as a slow reduction of unnecessary struggle. Siddhartha Gautama is no longer trying to control experience. He is no longer trying to fix the mind. He is no longer trying to reach a better internal state. And this absence of effort is not emptiness. It is clarity without pressure. Because most of human suffering does not come from life itself. It comes from the constant attempt to correct life internally, to adjust thoughts, to predict outcomes, to eliminate uncertainty. Suffering is sustained not by experience, but by resistance to experience. The mind amplifies discomfort when it tries to eliminate or control it. Now something very subtle is visible. Thoughts still appear. Sensations still arise. Emotions still move. But nothing is being escalated. A thought appears. What if something goes wrong? And instead of engagement, there is recognition. This is a mental construction, not a signal, not a command, not a truth, just activity. And when something is seen as activity, it loses authority. Siddhartha is not stopping thoughts. He is no longer adding identity to them. And this is the core shift. Not content change, but relationship change. The mind does not need correction. It needs non-identification. Distress increases when thoughts are interpreted as self or truth. At night, this becomes even more clear, because there is no distraction left, only raw mental activity. For most people, this is where anxiety grows strongest, because silence becomes a mirror, and the mind fills it with predictions. But here, something different is happening. Silence is no longer interpreted as danger. It is simply space. Not empty, not threatening, just open. And in open space, thoughts behave differently. They move without pressure. They rise without expansion. They pass without resistance. Siddhartha notices a very simple pattern. What is not resisted does not intensify. What is not reinforced does not persist strongly. Attention is the amplifier of experience. Mental intensity increases with attention investment. Now there is less internal compression, less need to resolve everything, less urgency to complete thought cycles. And this creates something very important. Psychological breathing room. Not physical breath, but cognitive space, where not everything requires meaning, not everything requires action, not everything requires interpretation. And in that space, anxiety loses structure, because anxiety depends on interpretation loops. Siddhartha is no longer feeding those loops, not through effort, but through non-participation. And this is where stability begins to appear naturally, not as control, but as reduced interference. Now something final begins to settle, not as an event, but as a condition. Siddhartha Gautama is fully present with experience, without trying to change it, without trying to escape it, without trying to improve it. And this is the deepest shift so far, because most minds operate on constant correction mode. This should be different. I should feel differently. This should be resolved. But here, that mechanism is quiet. And when correction stops, experience stabilizes on its own. Peace is what remains when correction stops. The nervous system returns to baseline when internal conflict decreases. Now thoughts continue, but they no longer define reality. They no longer demand reaction. They no longer create urgency. A thought appears. What about tomorrow? And it dissolves without expansion, because there is no engagement feeding it forward. And this is key. Future thinking is not the problem. Attachment to future thinking is. Siddhartha is not blocking the future. He is not entering it mentally as if it is happening now. And this distinction changes everything. The mind creates suffering when it treats simulation as reality. Anxiety is future simulation experienced as present truth. Now there is a very quiet realization forming. Not conceptual, not verbal, but experiential, that nothing in this moment requires resolution. Not now, not in this state. And this does not mean problems disappear. It means urgency disappears. And without urgency, the nervous system stops overreacting. Breathing becomes natural again. Attention becomes less narrow. Body stops holding invisible tension. Not because something is done, but because something is no longer being done internally. Siddhartha remains in awareness, but awareness is no longer disturbed by internal resistance. And this is the final transition. Not achievement, not conclusion, but release of unnecessary effort. Now bring this gently into yourself. There is nothing you need to fix right now. Nothing you need to solve in this moment. Nothing you need to complete mentally. Thoughts may still arise. but they do not require participation. They do not require interpretation. They do not require continuation. They can simply pass, like movement in space, without ownership, without pressure, without escalation. And in this way, the system begins to rest, not into emptiness, but into stability without effort. Siddhartha is still sitting, still aware, still present, but no longer in struggle with experience. And this is the final understanding in this sequence. Peace was never something added. It was something uncovered when interference stopped. And in this quiet recognition, nothing more is required.